Okay, in this video we want to discuss what is 3D object and 3D software. Let's start with what is a 3D object. For example, I add a torus here in Cinema 4D. I am on ground shading lines display mode. As you can see, this torus made up of smaller polygons that I'm showing with my mouse here. And each polygon's made up of these lines. And each line is connecting two vertices together. So the torus is the 3D object. It made up of polygons, and each polygon made up of edges, and each edge is a line between two vertices. And this is true about all objects in 3D software. Like here, look at this octopus. It made up of polygons, lines, and vertices. Or look at this bottle here. It made up of polygons, lines, and vertices. We call these building blocks of 3D object. So now you know what 3D object made up of. Our next question would be, what is a 3D software? When we say 3D software, we mean in general word. There is no difference between Blender, ZBrush, Rhino, DAWs, Marvelous Designer, or any other kind of 3D software. A 3D software is a program that lets you adjust and manipulate these building blocks of 3D objects. What was the building blocks? These polygon, vertices, and edges. And what we mean by adjusting and manipulating them. Let's, for example, open Sino 4D again, and let's add a deformer here, like taper deformer, under the torus, and let's adjust the value of this taper deformer. By changing the value of this taper deformer, as you can see, these vertices get closer to each other or getting apart and further from each other. So let's try another deformer, like bend deformer. Let's add it under torus, and by changing the value of the strength on bend deformer, as you can see, the object start to bend in the direction shown in the viewport. Let's try this with another object, something like a cube. Let's add a segmentation for it. This time let's use a generator, like subdivision surface, and add the cube beneath it. As you can see, subdivision surface added up to the building blocks of the object, added more vertices, and also make the edges smoother on the cube. So how this subdivision surface is manipulating our object? By adding up to the building blocks and changing the position of these building blocks on the edges. And this is true in all other 3D programs. For example, in Blender, let's do the same that we did in Cinema 4D. Let's add a modifier, come to generate, add subdivision surface, and as you can see, it is doing the same as we saw in Cinema 4D. It's adding more vertices to the object and changing the position of the vertices on the edges to make it look smoother to our eyes. But this is not all of the ways that we can manipulate and adjust the building blocks of 3D object. Let's, for example, see this Cinema 4D tutorial. As you can see, the object here is this sheet or cloth, and the building blocks are these polygons. Here he is manipulating this polygons position with the simulation stuff and not manipulating them with something like deformer or generator or modifiers in Blender. It adjusting this with nodes and simulation stuff in Houdini software. As you can see, this polygon position changes in a way that it conveys us this sheet is a cloth and it feels like a cloth. Or let's see this tutorial in ZBrush software. This is our 3D object. It made up of small polygons. You can see the edges of some of these here. And this time he is using a brush tool to push or pull on the surface of the 3D object. As you can see, he's making the polygons push down to the surface with this brush tool or pull it out from the surface. We can do the same in Blender with the sculpt mode. So as you saw, there is not real difference between 3D software, but what they are really doing on the object. They are all doing the same. They are changing the building blocks of 3D objects, sometimes with transformation like this point pushed down here, or this point pushed up here and rotated a little bit, or with something like a subdivision surface, it not just also changing the position of some points, but it also adding some points or vertices to the object. Some tools also remove some vertices from object, like we can add something like where was it, remesh generator, add the object under it, and let's decrease the mesh density. As you can see, it removed some points from the object, and this is all happening in different software, no difference. So sometimes we add or remove vertices on object, like what we saw here with subdivision or remesh generator in Cinema 4D, and sometimes we transform the position of these points like what we can see here. So if it is like that, then what's the difference between 3D software? Why we sometimes use different 3D software to do different stuff if they are doing all the same thing? Let's use a metaphor here. Consider a saw and a knife. Both of them used to cut stuff. Saw cuts wood and knife can be used to cut food and fruits. They're both cutting and both have very similar structure and functionality, but they used for different situations. If you want to cut a stiff and hard surface, you use a saw. If you want to cut something smaller and not as hard as wood, you use something like a knife. You can cut fruits and foods with saw, or you can cut woods with knife, but it is not that efficient. It is also true in 3D software. For example, in motion graphic, the artists mostly use Cinema 4D, or in simulations, the artists mostly use Houdini. You can also do simulations in Cinema 4D and there is nothing wrong with it. It also works great and you can get appealing results with Cinema 4D in simulations. But if you are exclusively doing simulations and if you want to have a robust tools and features for that, you probably need to switch to Houdini. Or ZBrush and Blender both can be used to sculpt character. You can sculpt in Blender. You can make any character you want. But if you're really into sculpting character and you want a complete workflow with all the tools needed, you probably needed to switch to ZBrush. There's nothing wrong with sculpting in Blender and it is much simpler to use Blender for that. But if you want to do some stuff that is very exclusive to sculpting industry, maybe you confront some limitations in Blender. So it is suggested to switch to ZBrush if you are doing sculpting exclusively. Or for something like hard surface modeling, you can use both 3ds Max and Blender and both can get you pleasing result that you like. But if you are really into modeling and you want to exclusively model, you probably needed to switch to something like 3ds Max, because it's in industry mostly, not always, mostly artists use 3ds Max for modeling, but there's nothing wrong with the Blender. So that was all for this video. Let's review what we learned. We started with what is a 3D object. We understood that 3D object is nothing more than polygons, edges and vertices, and it is true about all kind of 3D objects. Next, we asked what is 3D software, and we explained that is a program for adjusting or manipulating building blocks of 3D object. What was the building blocks? Is polygon, vertices and edges. And what we mean by adjusting or manipulating them, we mean add or removing points or vertices or polygons or transforming them. Like here, we transform this A point to this, or this point to this, or in Houdini, this point transform to this. Or for adding or removing, we saw, for example, subdivision surface, add vertices to object, and also change the position of edge vertices, and something like remesh generator, remove some vertices. We also saw that there are many different ways for manipulating this point. It doesn't have to be always something like a generator or deformer in Cinema 4D or a modifier in Blender. There are other tools like sculpting tools, or node-based system and simulation to manipulate these points. But what's really happening is not different in different software. Then we discussed what's the difference between 3D software. We used the metaphor of knife and saw, and we saw that we can do different things with different software, but each software is designed to exclusively do a specific task easier with much more robust workflow and tools for a specific kind of tasks. And that's all for this video.